Hi, James. Welcome to my channel.
Thank you.
We just met us at Rebecca's channel, Bread of Life.
Right.
So we decided to have a conversation here. So, as I was explaining you in private, um, I believe that the concept of God can be conceptualized in a way that it is not illogical. And therefore, the argument which I saw you bringing up at Rebecca's stream, that you think that all God concepts are illogical and therefore God cannot exist. Excuse me if I misunderstood you, but that's what I understood. I think that this claim, therefore, would be rejected. And I describe God to begin with as eternal, necessary, ultimate, powerful, conscious, intelligent, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, um, and powerful to create the physical universe.
Okay.
So I would say that as a hypothesis or a concept, there is nothing illogical, ontologically as well, impossible, that would make the existence of such a God with this description impossible. Would you agree with that?
I mean, there are things about that don't quite set well with me. For the example, immaterial as one of the things. And I'm what you might call a materialist. And because the term supernatural is the alternative that has been presented by the religious sphere as an alternative to natural. But the term supernatural doesn't actually mean anything. It says isn't natural, but then it doesn't present what it is instead. It's just a wild card or a placeholder for a concept that the claimant doesn't actually possess. So it's not a thing. And until somebody can present what it is, like, I don't even think it merits discussion or consideration. It's automatically irrational because it's a thing that doesn't mean anything being presented as a thing that means something. If there is a super entity and it's not nothing, if it's nothing, that's another way of saying doesn't exist. So, but if it's something in a very real way, not just as a concept, but it's a literal something, then that's another way of saying it does exist. And it means it would have to have a substance of some sort. It would have to have energy of some sort. Because if it has nothing of a substance, if it has nothing of an energy which it consists of and subsists of, then in that case, that's another way of saying is nothing, which is another way of saying doesn't exist. So we really have to choose between the position. If we want to say that an entity literally exists, then we're automatically saying it consists of some form of energy, coherent energy, allowing it to exist and permeating its functions. With that being the case, I see no distinction that can be made that would be rational to say that that isn't a natural thing, that it's something that isn't substance, that it's something that isn't material. Energy is material, and it would be material.
Yeah, I would be fine by not making this distinction between natural and supernatural. I would say reality is all that exists,
Okay,
and there is a part which we can detect through our senses, which is a small part, I would
sure.
say, of reality, and there is the biggest part which we cannot sense, which includes not only the physical universe but anything and everything beyond the physical universe.
Well, anything that exists beyond it is still physical by that definition that I presented. But sure, I mean, the known universe is certainly not all that there is, and cosmologists generally agree with that. We don't really know the full scope of everything, we only know what we can see.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree that whatever is beyond the physical universe would also be physical because by definition, the physical universe contains everything which is physical, and therefore there is a boundary, and whatever is beyond it is not physical. And I
Well,
would also make a distinction between the physical and the spiritual in the sense that as a dualist, I don't think that the mind and thoughts and intelligence and consciousness is something physical.
See, I do think that. I do think that it's a physical brain processing physical processes, using burning physical fuels. The energy that jumps across synapses are physical, energetic happenings, and the energy waves that produces, in the course of somebody having different thoughts, that's physical as well. You know, we don't think of it as physical necessarily because we tend to think of our thoughts as existing in this non-physical realm, but that's just, you know, kind of a cultural habit that's kind of been passed down to us, a way to think about it. I don't think it's a rational thing to think, that there's a differentiation really that needs to be made between, um, physical and non-physical. It's just, as I see it, it's all physical. And again, the reason I would say that is that there isn't an alternative on the table being presented. It's not as if there's two coherent ideas and I'm only picking the one. There is only the one coherent idea on the table, and that is naturalism. That is energy as a literal thing that exists and is governed by physics. Physics being, of course, the root word, sharing the root word of physical. It's the same thing. Anything governed by physics, anything that has physics, anything that exists in the real, that exists in reality, not just as a concept, is it consists of some form of energy that's governed by some form of physics, and there's nothing else. So,
Yeah, I have a quote here. I just put in the side chat the link to that site at my virtual library, and I'll read it for you. If thought and logic come from proteins, chemicals, and neurons, then laws of logic would be different for everybody since no one has the same chemical and neurological patterns. How would you respond to that?
so people's perceptions of logic, what they consider to be logical, certainly is independent to the mind, and for exactly that reason. However, so people's perception, logical facts as they exist independently of a mind being available to evaluate them. So, the fact that atoms exist and work a certain way is true, even if there are no minds around to think about it or appreciate it or understand it. So, in that sense, logic exists independently of any mind at all, and that's just, it is what it is. But in the sense of logic being a thought process that is used to evaluate the nature of things, that is, of course, entirely dependent on the existence of a physical mind.
Well, my problem with that perspective, James, is that let's suppose there were just matter and somehow it evolved neurons and then a brain with millions or trillions of or billions of neurons sticking together.
Sure,
Then somehow evolution would have produced the first conscious um, sense perception.
sure.
Let's just entertain that idea for a moment and think that this would be possible. Just from being conscious to go to understanding of language and even more um, using the laws of logic to make a sentence which would be logical and meaningful. That is a huge step where I have never seen anyone providing evidence that such a transition would be possible by natural means.
So recently, scientists discovered that mushrooms have a language and they communicate chemically, and that the different chemical signatures indicate different perceptual awarenesses. It's, of course, very limited, and they don't have thought processes the way humans do, but it is the most rudimentary, basic example of language arising from sensory processes, mushrooms. And then, of course, I watched a World Science Festival um, scheduled event. They do it every year, about the very topic, and they talk about how scientists do believe that they can account for the way that human language has developed. Animals, of course, that aren't human have their own independent languages. They're just not as developed, and part of that reason is that they don't have our vocal cords. Part of it's because they don't have hands and fingers. Part of it's because they don't have the same level of activity happening in their brain. But the point that I'm making is that language is reducibly complex based on the capacities of the organism that's developing it. And it did, as far as scientists are concerned, develop naturally. It's not like we just showed up one day and were given language by a magical being in the sky.
Well, I mean, the most basic thing that you would actually need in order to establish communication is to have a sender and a receiver, and then, of course, the communication channel. And then there has to be a common agreement of meaning between both parts.
Perhaps, but they wouldn't necessarily need to even be sentiently aware of each other or have a conversation of agreement and meaning. If a certain chemical stimuli um, gets translated into an electrical set of signals, and another creature of the same type happens to receive those signals, and if its experiences of the world are the same, then this chemical signal will mean the same thing to the receiver as the sender, even if they don't, even if the sender didn't mean to send anything, even if the receiver is not consciously aware of the sender, it's still processing the signal the same way. So, I would say that self-awareness isn't even a prerequisite of communication, or intelligent sentience isn't. But I think the more intelligent an organism is, and the more self-aware it is, and the more others aware it is, this creates more and more opportunities, and more need for further developed forms of communication, which I do think happen to develop naturally over time and per necessity.
Well, even if we take away for a moment the part of consciousness, and if we are talking just about communication and the concept of communication, you need basically a sender, a transmission system, and a receiver.
Sure.
And if there is not a common agreement of meaning between the sender and the receiver, you cannot establish communication, right?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by common agreement. If a certain feeling creates a certain electrical activity, and if that electrical activity travels across, say, a root system between plants, travels up the roots to another plant that's very similar, and if it translates back into the same chemical signature, then the plant next to it would respond to the same stimuli as if it had, like, for example, plant number one receives some sunlight and it generates a certain electrical signature. It travels down through its roots, travels to the ground, travels up through the roots of the next plant. The next plant, if it's still in the shade, might start to unfold as if it's about to receive some sun or some rain, because it's the communication happened in such a way where it thinks it just received stimuli, or not necessarily thinks in a cognitive sense, but it responds as if it receives stimuli from sun or rain, even though it's really only responding to stimuli from the plant next to it that received sun or rain. And so as the clouds move and as the rain moves, then the plant next to it that hadn't actually received that stimuli yet, and instead only received electrical impulses that indicate the stimuli from the next plant next to it. Now it finally does start to receive sun or rain because now the clouds have moved and it's in an ideal position because it has kind of opened its petals or whatever to make a maximum use of that sun and that rain. Now they're not consciously aware, they're just flowers or just plants. But on that rudimentary level, we're talking about electrical impulses that functioned as communication. So it can happen without any sentience at all, really. And then, of course, more sentient um, organisms would have more stimuli coming in and would produce more responses to that stimuli. And it would in turn affect other organisms of the same or similar nature in their environment. So I think it's completely reducibly complex to the most basic levels that even a mushroom can do it. And I think that it makes sense that early humans, proto humans, developed rudimentary senses of communication. One of the ways that happened was eventually some early version of human was banging rocks against other rocks. for whatever reason. Maybe they were bored. And if they happened to do it in such a way where it created a pattern, then it would catch the attention of the next human or proto-human next to them, because they've never heard sound happen in that pattern before. And now they're curious. So now they, kind of like walk over, or whatever motion they do to move, and they grab a rock and they look at the other person who's banging this rock against the first rock, and then they start to do it. And now they're both doing it, and they're getting really happy, jumping around. Ugh, ugh, ugh! Isn't this fun? And now they've accidentally created the foundations of music. And what scientists have realized is that if you have certain rhythmic patterns, which is why teenagers that learn how to play drums early on, they become more intelligent because of it. So here there was a catalyst that was increasing brain function in ways that no one could have expected. And then pretty soon the whole tribe of these early humans without real communication were all banging rocks in rhythmic ways and looking for other things to bang against other things to make cool new sounds. Now they've kind of developed music, or at least the foundations of music, and a form of communication. So then they pass that on to their descendants, they pass it on to their descendants, and these descendants, as a result, become increasingly intelligent, because it's creating processes in the brain that are building new neurological connections that didn't exist before. And so as that happens, each next generation gets a little bit smarter because they're being exposed to these rhythms in this rudimentary form of communication. And so they're getting better at creating even more complex patterns, appreciating those patterns, and then they begin to assign meaning to those patterns, because different patterns of music make people feel in different ways. So now it becomes even closer to a form of coherent communication. So through this process, evolutionary speaking, people get smarter naturally, and they have developed the foundations of both music and communication. And so that every generation becomes a little smarter, not literally every generation, but eventually they do. And then that's just how that happens. So scientists have been able to account for how language and music were able to develop in tandem and with each other in ways that didn't require that any particular super being show up one day and like beam intelligence into their heads. Like, that wasn't necessary.
Yeah, I think you started far too late with your narrative, James, because I mean, plants, they have very complex communication systems, and humans and apes, of course, much even more.
Sure.
But I think if we start really from the basic, from a rudimentary situation, I don't see why molecules would ever need to establish communication whatsoever. They would just, I mean, the first problem which I have is with single cells. There is no life without intracellular communication. I mean, each individual cell, there is a lot of different signaling going on inside of a cell.
Sure.
And life had even to start with internal communication, because without it, you cannot have survival and adaptation to your surroundings. Because the cell, it senses the surrounding through information transmission, through gates and the membrane. They sense what is going on in the outside, and then they adapt to the environment. And the adaptation had to start when life started. And in order for you to have that, you need signaling inside of the cell. And I don't know if you are a little bit educated in biochemistry, but in order to establish signaling, you need calcium signaling. And in order to have calcium signaling inside of the cell, you need homeostasis, and the concentration of calcium inside has to be 10,000 times less than in the outside. So even to start to have signaling inside of the cell, you need to solve that problem. And that's not solved by science. Now, let's suppose that this would be the case, and somehow life would have started figuring out by natural means to establish that homeostasis and that imbalance between the inside of the cell and the outside, and cells would have been able to start adapting through signaling and so forth. And we have that situation. And now let's suppose that this would have emerged prebiotically even twice. I mean, when they talk about LUCA, which is the last universal common ancestor, then they are not talking about a single cell, but they say that that was already a community of different organisms interacting together. Okay, so if you start from that scenario, that you would have that first community of cells, then that would be a starting point to figure out how could or would they start to communicate together. And as I said previously, you need to have a common agreement of meaning in order to start communicating. You need the sender, the receiver, you need the communication channels, and that are three interdependent parts. If you have a sender but no receiver which understands the message, how do you establish or even start the establishing of this communication? It is not possible. That's why I am saying that communication is in its basics an irreducibly complex system.
Well, I mean, communication on that level wouldn't be like you and I talking. It would simply be stimuli, chemical signatures, and then causing chemical processes that interact per the laws of physics. So, you know, this part of a protein structure doesn't have to know anything. It doesn't have to be sentient in order for another part of a structure to respond in such a way where they link up, or where they find a way to harmonize and work together. I mean, functional parts will naturally draw to each other and create more complex functions. And this is what we've seen in science. Now, I understand that the implication that you're working with is that it would take a super intelligence outside of it in order to arrange for it to happen, because how else could it happen? For me, as I look to it, now it's not my field, but I do notice that the higher up the chain you get of scientists, whether they be physics or in biology, the fewer and fewer theists there are. The elite scientists in all of those fields, somewhere between 6 and 7% of them believe in a god. And of that very, very small percentage of elite scientists who think that there is a god, an even smaller percent think that a god is evidenced in the work that they do and the discoveries that they find. None of them assume a god, and very, very few of them conclude a god from the work that they do. Some do. Some conclude a god, but very, very few do. So, as a layman, I'm willing to concede that there are aspects of biology and aspects of chemistry and other aspects of physics that I know nothing about and couldn't comment on. So and I don't think that there's a human on Earth that is completely versed in every overlapping field all at once. That's why we have specialties, because humans are limited in their ability to gather information and process it in a practical way. So they have to rely on people and in other overlapping fields to make up the difference, and they work together. And so scientists in this field will assume that the scientist in that field knows what they're talking about, because they're going to have to assume it. And that trust is earned, of course. It's not arbitrary. So we have all these high-end specialists who look at what you're looking at. They don't see what you see. They don't, if it's inevitably logical to draw their conclusion, and these are highly logical people by nature, they have to be in order to do their job. I would expect that the higher the chain you go up the scale in scientific fields, the more theology you're going to find. Instead, you find less theology.
Well, that has never been for me a parameter that I followed, just by saying, well, because some scientists say so, therefore it must be true.
Sure.
My modus operandi has always been to take biochemistry books to study the science, what is the
Sure.
evidence, and then make my own inferences based on that evidence, and disrespecting completely what others say. That has been the way how I have come to my conclusions.
Oh, I understand that.
And from that perspective, it is completely irrelevant to me what others say. And they can have the highest degrees, they can be Nobel Prize winners. It doesn't matter to me. I just want to make up my mind by myself, by looking into the science, trying to understand it. And then from there I go. And I'm doing that for at least 10 years.
Hmm.
And I spend a lot of time to educate myself in regards of various different scientific fields. And
Sure.
biochemistry is one which I am especially fascinated about, what
Hmm.
happens inside of the cell. And communication is a big topic in regards of um, the quest of origins. I mean,
Sure.
uh, I mean, uh, you know that the genome stores information which is not just described, but it is prescribed. It means that the information stored there directs the making of proteins and also directs how the cell is operating, how it works, how
Sure.
it adapts, and so forth. And of course, that is a big issue. Where does that information come from? And in special when we move away from evolution or the quest of biodiversity and come to investigate the origin of life, how everything started actually.
Hmm.
And what we know is that even the most simple and rudimentary free living cell is enormously complex.
Sure.
And it has to store a huge amount of information in the genome. And
Sure.
just to give you an example, the smallest free living bacteria known today is Pelagibacter rubic, and it has about 1.3 million nucleotides.
Okay.
So it is very difficult to make a top-down investigation because nobody knows what the first organism looked like.
Sure.
But what we know is that the first traces to the first life are in stromatolites in Australia. It's claimed they are about 3.5 billion years old, and they are remains of cyanobacteria.
Okay.
And cyanobacteria, they are already far more complex than Pelagibacter rubic. The simplest cyanobacteria has maybe about 2 million nucleotides. So it's more complex than this organism, which is the smallest known. So you have to ask yourself, um, how did that state of affairs of complexity come to be? And um, you have basically two options here. Either you resort to an intelligent creator, which instantiated the first life and injected that information in the genome, or you are left with unguided random stochastic natural events without intelligence involved. You cannot resort to evolution because evolution depends on DNA replication. And this is basically the dichotomy, which is the entire theism atheism debate. Was intelligence involved in the construction of the universe, life, biodiversity, consciousness, morality, and so forth, or was no intelligence required? And abiogenesis is a really great topic to study and to think about these issues if
So,
intelligence was necessary.
so you're not challenging evolution of species. You think that did happen. What you're challenging is how abiogenesis began.
Well, I have actually studied both topics. Evolution has to be defined. What you mean by evolution? I think there are aspects of evolution which are confirmed, which are fact, which is undisputed also in the creationism community and intelligent design community. We don't dispute that, which is adaptation, which is there is even pre-programmed evolution where animals are programmed to adapt to the environment. As I told you before, even the first life form had to have mechanisms to be able to adapt to the environment. That is a fact. What is in dispute is if the tree of life is actually factual. That means that there was supposedly a last universal common ancestor which diverged into the three domains of life, and then from there, all other species evolved over a huge period of time. that is in dispute, and in my
So
understanding, that is not
scientists
involved.
scientists don't dispute it. Scientists accept that evolution of species is fact. There are only some what I call fringe unemployables who say otherwise. It's considered intelligent design and creationism is considered pseudoscience by the scientific community. The fact is that if you were to go back enough generations, my dad to his dad to his dad, etc., if you were to go back millions of years, you aren't finding humans anymore. You're finding something which isn't a human now. You go back even further, and it's going to be even less like humans. And that's just how the evolution of species went. We evolved from completely different species into what we are today, and we're not even done evolving. Like if humanity managed to not kill itself off and we somehow managed to survive, which seems unlikely at this point, but if we do, a million years from now, we won't be able to recognize whatever species has taken our place. Well, it'll have changed too much. It'll be nothing like us at all.
Yeah, this is the let's say mainstream narrative, and talking point pseudoscience. What is pseudoscience? I see pseudoscience. I give that explanation. At least I understand that under that name. If you look into a natural phenomena, then you look at it from a superficial perspective, and based on a small part of information, you come to a conclusion. But if you look closer into that, then a completely new picture arises, which permits you and can lead you to a completely different conclusion.
So you're
So
thinking evolution of species isn't true then in your view?
well, it has never been substantiated, and that is because I see many approaches they are inadequate. Like, for example, looking into the fossil record and looking into phylogeny is not the way I think someone should actually come to a conclusion about what the mechanisms are which instantiate organismal complexity. What we need to do and what scientists need to do, they need to look into a molecular level. They need to look into the mechanisms that happen inside of the cell. And there is where you actually find the real action. And my conclusion, James, is that organismal complexity is not instantiated just based on genetic information, but there is a far more complex world, which is epigenetics. And science has so far unraveled over 45 different epigenetic languages and codes. And they are all involved in communication, in signaling. There are six different signaling pathways which are also involved. And the real picture is actually that the making of complex organisms is far, far more complex than science has unraveled up to now. And I think that in the next 50 or 100 years, there will be such more complex layers of complexity unraveled by science that we are not even imagining right now. Like just giving you an example, there is just one epigenetic language, which is the glycan code or sugar code, which is a structure instantiated by sugars attached to proteins on the cell membrane. And that is a code which cells, they communicate with other cells through that glycan code. And that code is far, far more complex than the genetic code. And it is also part of how complex organisms are constructed. So the question is, of course, where does all that complexity come from? And we are talking here about signaling pathways of even these 5 signaling pathways. These are different languages which communicate with each other. It is as I, as an English-speaking person, would communicate with a Chinese-speaking person, and we would understand us. Okay, and I am also talking about interconnected complexity, or complexity on an organism level, where you have even communication on a distant level from one cell at one place with another cell at a distant place in the body, and they interact and communicate with each other.
Sure.
So, what I am saying here, James, is that the narrative that evolutionary mechanisms like natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow is far too simple to explain the complexity of organisms. So once we have actually unraveled what actually is happening in the cell and in multicellular organisms, then we also know what would have to be instantiated and changed to go from a simple to a more complex organism.
Well, sure. And
And
once we get there, then certainly the discussion needs to be reopened, and someone needs to say, okay, now that we know all the complexities and now that we understand how they relate, now let's talk about whether or not that's irreducibly complex or not. Let's talk about whether or not that could have developed naturally without a guiding intelligent hand or not. But
well, this is a conversation. This is a debate which is actually going on in the scientific community, and the theory of evolution, as you know, is under constant change and
well, sure. But
adaptation
it's
upon new information which is actually coming up. And what is happening is that those which are working in the field, like Gerd Müller and others, they recognize what I am just telling you. Of course, I've talked to Gerd Müller, I had an email exchange with him, and since they grew up, they are already in the 60s, 70s, they grew up with that idea of evolution. And even if new evidence comes up, they are not willing or able to actually make a paradigm shift because that's what they have learned and what they work with during their entire
so
life.
So there's two different things. There's the fact of gravity and the theory of gravity. The fact of gravity is that gravity happens. The theory of gravity is the study of how it happens, like what causes it and how does it interact with the rest of physics, even how does it relate to time. These are all part of the theory of gravity, and so the theory continues to develop, and we get new understandings, and we abandon some of our old understandings about how it happens, how it works, how it relates to the larger systems that it's part of. Evolution's the same way. Evolution of species is fact, but the theory of evolution is the study of how it happens. And we're still trying to, like you said, get a better and better understanding of exactly how it happened. So, in the meantime, let's suppose that the end result is that scientists finally discover and verify that abiogenesis cannot have happened without an external guiding hand. Well, okay, let's just grant that for the sake of argument that eventually we get there and that's the conclusion. It's not what most scientists think is going to be the conclusion, but maybe it ends up being the conclusion. There is an awful long way, logically speaking, to go from it had to be intelligently designed or instigated to God. Huge amount of space between these two concepts because super intelligent aliens could have done it. We could all be living in a matrix, and it's simply everything that we study in science. We're only studying what's designed in the matrix, and we know nothing at all about the external world. And so we can't even comment one way or the other about how cells work. This could all be a dream. So many different things are possible that we can't rule out. So this idea that we either have to choose between these fantastically random chance events to happen or a god is a false economy. We've got a lot of other options to choose from, and we haven't ruled them out yet. Now, even if we decide, or even if it's generally concluded, and even if someone convinces me someday that a super intelligence arranged and instigated abiogenesis, and that what we think about evolution was wrong, and he really created us in a garden or whatever, proving to me that a super being exists isn't the same thing as proving to me that a God exists. Because the term God is a reverential expression. It means something that I have a reverent regard for. That's what the title means. So if somebody worships the sun, they don't got to prove to me the sun exists. I know it exists. Therefore, their God exists. But it's not my God because I don't worship it. Same thing with the tree worshiper. Trees exist. As far as I know, they exist within the confines of our matrix or our reality, our perceptual reality. It's verified to exist in my satisfaction trees exist. But I don't worship a tree, therefore it's not my God. So it's a God within their narrative perspective, within their mental paradigm, but it's not a God within mine. Now, if you were to ever convince me, or if scientists ever decided that the consensus was that there was a super intelligence involved in creating and designing things, a lot of people would say, wow, you've proven a God exists. But I wouldn't. Even if they convinced me too, I would not be saying, wow, you proved that a God exists. I'd be saying, you proved that a super entity exists. Not the same thing. These are not exchangeable terms. So then, and it's a whole other issue to talk about whether or not a super being as described in Bibles exists, because that's a whole other argument, and I'm quite convinced that God doesn't exist, that super being doesn't exist, whether or not we want to give it the title of God or not. But it's like a whole other issue. We shouldn't conflate these two. So, if a deist says, I think God exists, and a Christian says, I think God exists, they're not saying the same thing. They're making two completely different statements. It just sounds like it's the same thing. So we need to keep in mind that we need to avoid accidentally conflating these terminologies, which is the reason why I think the word God should be retired from vocabulary. We should just quit using it because it is so generic. As Carl Sagan pointed out, it makes no sense to use the word God because every single person you say it to has a different idea in mind about what that is. And it's exhausting to have to clarify exactly what you mean by God every time you use the word. But if you don't, then you're not really communicating. You're not really having the same discussion as the person that agrees or disagrees with you, because it means something different to you than it means to the other guy. So the term God works against communication, which makes it particularly ironic since we're using communication in order to prove that God exists. So, these are separable issues, and I think that they need to be treated as separate.
Well, I think that, I use the method of a cumulative argument for God's existence. I start not with the Christian God. There are others which take a different approach. First, in my conversation with an atheist, I try to elucidate, do you think that it is the best worldview to believe that a creator, an intelligent, eternal, conscious, powerful being exists or not? I'm not saying it is God, the God of the Bible, or the God of any other religion. And in order to come to the conclusion, I think when you said, well, I don't know if God exists or not, I was thinking, well, we can at least make the differentiation between things that we know intelligence can instantiate and things that non-intelligence cannot instantiate. And once we have figured it out, we can look into the natural world and then eventually see and observe if there are signs of things that eventually intelligence was necessary to instantiate these things. And I actually, for studying this for years, for me, there is so powerful evidence starting with physics to chemistry to biology. Actually, intelligence was necessary to instantiate all these things, which is the universe, life, and biodiversity. Again, I am not saying it is the Christian God at this moment. All I am saying that I think that intelligence had to be involved. Now, you can, of course, resort to aliens, but since they would have to exist inside of our universe, you then still have to answer, well, what made these aliens?
Well, aliens don't necessarily have to exist in our universe. They could have came from a parallel universe. They could have came from a prior existing universe. I'm not even saying I believe in aliens. I'm just saying that there are other ideas on the table that we equally can't rule out, and that by comparison are certainly more likely than God. But here's the thing. I'm not saying, again, that a super being or one or more don't exist. I'm not saying that they didn't have a hand in tinkering with the universe's design or apparent design or whatever. I'm saying that even if some super beings did do that, they're still not a god. Because in order for it to be a god, it has to be worthy of the title. It can't just make some stuff and say, oh, well, that's a god. A god has to be worthy of the reverence in order for the title to apply. And no being worthy of that reverence can exist. Therefore, one does not exist.
Yeah, I think it is not necessary to start actually by defining that being as God, which then requires reverence. I said that the main distinction to be discussed as a first conversation is if intelligence was necessary and involved in creating our universe or not. And once you have elucidated then that question, then you can move on in that cumulative argument.
Right. Well, I've studied the issues, not all the same things that you've studied. I mean, because we can't, right? There's just too many things to learn. Even if science stopped progressing today, and even if all I did morning, noon, and night was study science books, I would not have time to accumulate all the presently available understanding of science, even if it didn't continue. Like, there's not enough time in anyone's life. So I can't account for what you've learned or what patterns you've recognized. I can't say that you're right or wrong about it. I could take your word for it, or I could not. I'd rather not. I don't like taking anybody's word for anything. But your experience has led you to a conclusion that there is undeniably an intelligence that had a hand in designing things. And while that is a minority conclusion among scientists, that doesn't automatically prove you're wrong. You could be right. I don't know. But, it's inconsequential to me if there was an intelligence that had a hand in it or not, because it did a crappy job of making this universe if it did. And I think it should be ashamed of itself. So moving forward from there, I mean, what would I even do with that if I don't become religious with the idea, and I just have the idea that there was a super intelligence, one or more super intelligent beings that had a hand in creating our universe? I've known a lot of deists, and I ask them, what do you do with that? And they say nothing, because our God doesn't make any demands on us. We're not in a religion. Our God simply exists, and that's it. And then, so there's not really an automatic bridge between the idea of a super creator and religion. It can just be a super creator in somebody's mind. It's inconsequential to me. I don't really care if there was a super creator, because it has nothing to do with the way I live my life. If I were to decide tomorrow that there surely must be one, now what? I'm still going to eat the same things I was going to eat. I'm still going to watch the same things on YouTube I was going to watch. I'm still going to do the same work I always do. It's not going to really change anything. My morals are even still going to be the same and develop according to the same line they were already on, because we're talking about a theoretical being that I'm now theoretically convinced of, that isn't making any moral demands on me, that's not doing anything or saying anything. So it's inconsequential. It just doesn't matter.
No, I completely agree with you. And of course, I, as a Christian, wouldn't stop with that. So let's suppose that after some time of having a conversation and so forth and information exchange, you would come to the conclusion, yeah, it seems that intelligence somehow had to be involved. I wouldn't stop there with you. I would go on, and then I would ask you, what is most likely the identity of that intelligence, and how can we come to the conclusion that X is actually that creator, that intelligence? That would be a subsequential conversation.
Sure.
I am just as an evidentialist apologist. I use that approach, dialogue with atheists, to start first with that basic question: what do you think? Is intelligence the better explanation of our existence and universe and so forth, or not? That is the basic issue. Of course, I could also use the pre-sup approach, which I am familiar with, where I would start with God and then actually try to defend that proposition that God exists, which is something which a ton of people, they are using that method. I am not very convinced that it is an effective approach. No. But in the end, my conviction, James, is that there isn't one or another approach which is better in a conversation like this. Why? because I think that if I truly want to find the truth, then I don't exclude God as a possibility a priori. I can also even start with God as the presupposition, and then from there trying to find evidence, which would be confirmation bias. I agree with you, but I don't see it as a bad approach to start like that. And the Bible says, "Who seeks finds." So if you seek God, you will find Him. And
Sure, it
I
says that.
started like this when I was a teenager. I didn't start with intelligent design. This is something which came up to me in my dialogue with atheists. I started with the need actually because I was going through depression and I wanted to find a solution. And it had nothing to do with reason. It had to do with a personal need that I had.
Sure.
And God was the solution to that need. And since there, I am on that walk.
Well, if it helps you, I'm glad that it helps you. And I said this to Rebecca earlier. I don't know if you were in the stream by then or not, but if I had a way, like if I knew some perfect argument that could deconvert any Christian I bring it to, I would never use the argument. A lot of atheists would. They'd be like, "Ha, finally, we have an argument that always works." I wouldn't. I'd put that argument in a box and never tell anybody about it. And the reason is because I don't want the responsibility for the potential fallout in a person's life if I take that from underneath them. And if it was helping them with their depression, and it was helping them with their anxiety, and it was helping them like be a better person in life, and I take that away from them with some powerful fact of logic they can't escape, now what? Now they've got all this personal fallout and this depression and anxiety, and the world's crumbling underneath them, and maybe they'll recover and maybe they won't. I don't want that responsibility. I don't necessarily know that you're better off not being a Christian. I don't know
Yeah,
that.
I am glad. I am really glad that you see it that way because this is something which I have a lot thought about because there are tons of atheists out there, in special these atheist shows, which I've called in several times, and you never see actually any of these hosts to sincerely seeking to convert to Christianity or any other kind of religion. They
Sure.
have already made up their mind, and they are trying to drag down believers to their unbelief, while
Well,
consequence of this is that you basically just lose hope and everything that your faith gives you.
well,
And what is the purpose of this,
no, I understand that, but I want to make something really clear. There are many non-theists. We'll just avoid the word atheist for a moment. There are a great many non-theists in the world who feel very happy and content with their life. They have a sense of purpose, a multi-layered sense of purpose that's rich and rewarding, and they feel loved and they feel hope for the future. They're not overcome with anxiety. They don't feel a God-shaped hole in their heart. They
No,
do
I
fine
agree
without it.
with you. Yes,
So
of
I think
course.
it's important to recognize that some people are better off with theism, and some people are really good off with Christianity or whatever version of it that they've clung to. Other people are just as well off in this life. The next life's a different issue, but in this life, they're just as well off without it. Some people become less depressed when they become a theist. Some people become less depressed when they leave theism because people are wired for different needs. We all have different, you
Yeah,
know,
it depends a lot also in what kind of community that you are in. There are many depressive Christian churches which are full of legalism and so forth. And I've seen many atheists being Christians before and leaving for being disappointed with what they have experienced inside of the church. But James, it is a nice conversation with you, but I have to go right now.
okay.
And I think it was a nice conversation. And if you want another time, we can set something up on Facebook and then continue what we were talking about.
Yeah, sure. There's lots more I'm sure both of us have to say, so we can better clarify our views. And this was a good start. And I do apologize. Sometimes I get so passionate about a point that I might sound angry in the moment, but I promise I'm not angry.
No, no, it was fine, and it was a good to talk to you.
Awesome. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll talk to you soon.
Good, great. Have a good night. Bye bye. See you next time.
You
Bye,
too.
everyone. Ciao.
Bye.